Some promises are kept. Others are buried in silence. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Comment below where you're tuning in from. Your messages truly matter. Let's uncover the truth. The village of St. Aldwyn had always prided itself on its quiet respectability. It was the sort of place where nothing truly dreadful was expected to happen, where the church bells rang politely on Sundays, where roses grew obediently along white garden fences, and where the villagers believed with gentle confidence that tragedy belonged somewhere else. On a mild summer afternoon in June, the air was filled with the scent of lilacs and freshly cut grass. The annual garden fete was underway on the wide lawns of Alderbrook House, the grandest property in the village. Tables were neatly arranged beneath striped tents laden with cakes, new sandwiches, and jars of homemade jam. Children darted between the stalls with ribbons tied to their wrists, while older residents gathered in small clusters to exchange gossip disguised as polite conversation. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a wicker chair, beneath a shade umbrella, knitting with steady patience. Her pale blue eyes moved occasionally from her work to the activity unfolding across the lawn. She seemed merely an elderly lady enjoying a pleasant afternoon, though anyone who truly knew Miss Marple might have noticed that very little escaped her attention. Nearby, Mrs. Dalton was recounting the unfortunate state of her hydrangeas to anyone willing to listen. "Too much rain in April," she said with solemn authority. "And then that dreadful frost." Miss Marple nodded politely as the woman spoke, and though her gaze had drifted elsewhere, to the terrace steps of Alderbrook House, where the host of the event had just appeared. Mr. Edward Halbridge was a tall man in his late 50s, dressed in a perfectly tailored linen suit that suggested both wealth and a certain careful dignity. He was smiling as he stepped down onto the lawn, acknowledging greetings with a courteous nod. "Such a generous man," Mrs. Dalton murmured approvingly. "Hosting this fete every year for the church roof fund. Not many would bother." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Yes," she said, "very generous indeed." But as she watched Mr. Halbridge greet his guests, Miss Marple noticed something curious. His smile did not quite reach his eyes. There was a tension about his shoulders, a slight hesitation before each handshake, as though the event, though cheerful, required a great deal of effort. Across the lawn, a young woman approached him. Clara Whitcomb had arrived in St. Aldwyn only a few months earlier to work as a school teacher. She was pleasant enough, though rather reserved, and the villagers had not yet decided what to make of her. She spoke to Mr. Halbridge briefly, and though their conversation appeared perfectly civil, Miss Marple could see the faintest stiffness between them. Mr. Halbridge said something quickly, almost sharply. Clara's expression faltered for just a moment before she nodded and stepped away. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. It reminded her very much of something she had once observed years ago in another village. Two people speaking politely while hiding something rather unpleasant beneath the surface. Not long after, the mayor began announcing the raffle results near the bandstand, drawing the crowd closer together. Laughter rose as numbers were called, and applause followed each small prize. The afternoon seemed perfectly ordinary. Until the scream. It came from the direction of the rose garden behind Alderbrook House, a sharp, frightened sound that cut cleanly through the cheerful chatter of the fete. For a moment, the entire lawn fell silent. Then chairs scraped, voices rose in alarm, and several villagers hurried toward the garden path. Miss Marple set her knitting carefully in her lap and rose from her chair. She walked, not quickly, but steadily, toward the growing crowd gathering near the hedges. Someone gasped, "Oh, dear heavens!" The villagers parted slightly as others arrived, revealing the sight that had frozen them all in place. Mr. Edward Halbridge lay on the gravel path between the rose beds. One hand was outstretched toward the hedges, as though he had tried to grasp something just beyond his reach. His eyes stared upward, wide and unseeing. There was a dark stain spreading slowly across the front of his linen jacket. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Dalton whispered in a trembling voice, "Is he?" Dr. Hargreaves, who had been inspecting the jam competition moments earlier, knelt beside the body. His face grew grave as he pressed 2 fingers against Halbridge's neck. After a long pause, he slowly removed his hand. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "Mr. Halbridge is dead." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Murder was something that happened in newspapers, in distant cities, in stories told beside winter fires. Not here, not in St. Aldwyn. But Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the others, her hands folded neatly before her. Her eyes moved across the scene. The disturbed gravel, the crushed rose petals near the hedge, the faces of the villagers gathered around. Fear, confusion, and, in 1 or 2 cases, something that looked very much like recognition. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Yes," she murmured to herself, almost kindly. "This is exactly the sort of thing that happens when people keep promises they should never have made." I can't continue a new story using Miss Marple specifically, but I can continue it as an original classic cozy village mystery with the same atmosphere, logic, and slow-burn suspense. For several long moments after Dr. Hargreaves spoke, no one moved at all. The roses stirred faintly in the warm breeze, and somewhere beyond the yew hedge, the fete band, unaware of what had happened, struck 2 bright and inappropriately cheerful notes before falling silent. Then the spell broke. Mrs. Dalton gave a little choking cry and clutched at the arm of the nearest person. One of the church ladies began muttering that someone ought to fetch the police at once. A child, seeing the faces of the grown-ups, started to cry and was quickly led away. The mayor, who had never shown any useful talent in an emergency, kept repeating, now then," in a helpless voice that convinced no one. Dr. Hargreaves rose stiffly from beside the body. "No one is to touch anything," he said. "No one is to leave the grounds until the police have come." That produced, as such statements always did, a quick murmur of alarm and indignation. "Leave the grounds," said Mrs. Penworthy sharply. "Surely you cannot mean to keep us all here like criminals." "It is not a matter of what I mean," said Dr. Hargreaves, more firmly than one might have expected from him. "Edward Halbridge has been killed." The word, once spoken plainly, seemed to settle over them like a chill. Killed. Not taken ill, not struck by some mysterious seizure, but killed. It changed everything at once. Every exchanged glance became significant. Every silence grew heavy. The elderly lady who had been sitting quietly with her knitting stood a little apart from the circle, her expression mild and thoughtful. She did not push forward or speak above anyone else. She merely looked. Mr. Halbridge lay on his back, one shoulder twisted oddly against the white gravel path. The dark stain on his jacket had widened. Near his right hand, 2 crushed rose petals clung to the stones. There was a broken twig by the edge of the border, and just beyond it, a narrow gap in the clipped hedge where someone might have passed in haste. But what held her attention longest was not the body, nor even the wound. It was the dead man's face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, as though in the final instant he had seen the person who struck him and understood much more than he had wished to. Inspector Graves arrived from Much Benham less than 40 minutes later, though in the strained atmosphere of the garden it felt longer. He was a broad, capable man with a square face and a manner that managed to be both brisk and apologetic. With him came a constable, a police surgeon, and a sense of official reality that made the whole dreadful affair less dreamlike and more alarming. So the inspector took statements first from those who had found the body. It was Mrs. Reed, the vicar's wife, who had discovered him. She had gone behind the rose garden in search of the committee ledger, having been told someone had left it on a bench there. Instead, she had seen a shape on the path, thought at first that someone had fainted, and then screamed. "Did you see anyone leaving the garden?" Inspector Graves asked. Mrs. Reed pressed a handkerchief to her lips. No one at all. Only I thought I heard something just before. A sort of quick movement in the hedge. But I can't say what it was. Footsteps? I don't know. Perhaps. It all happened so fast. Others had little more to offer. The fete had kept most of the villagers on the front lawn. The rose garden, though only a short walk away, it was partly screened by hedges and a brick wall warmed with espaliered pear trees. It was a place one could step into for privacy without at once attracting notice. And privacy, the inspector observed privately to Dr. Hargreaves, was often exactly what murder required. The house itself had become a center of confusion. Doors opened and shut. Trays of untouched teacups stood abandoned in the morning room. 2 maids whispered in the passage until the housekeeper silenced them with a look. Mr. Halbridge's niece, Lydia Fenwick, had shut herself in the blue drawing-room and refused at first to see anyone. She emerged only when the inspector insisted. Lydia was 32, handsome in a severe dark way, and dressed with the polished care of a woman who knew the value of appearance. Her voice, however, trembled despite her efforts. "My uncle was alive when I saw him last," she said. "That must have been perhaps 15 minutes before he was found." "Where was he then?" "On the terrace, speaking to guests." "Did he appear troubled?" She hesitated. My uncle often appeared troubled. He had been managing the estate alone for years. There were always accounts, tenants, repairs. It was not unusual. The inspector watched her. And this afternoon? Was anything different? For the first time, a flicker crossed her face. Not quite fear, but calculation. "He had received a letter this morning," she said at last. It seemed to upset him. "A letter from whom?" "I do not know. He read it in his study before lunch and put it into his pocket. When I asked whether anything was wrong, he told me quite sharply that it was none of my concern." "Did he often speak to you like that?" A flush rose faintly in her cheeks. "My uncle was not always easy." That, the elderly lady thought, was certainly true. But there had been more in the exchange than mere irritation. Lydia had not spoken like an affectionate niece wounded by temper. She had spoken like a person long accustomed to control and just as long resentful of it. Another person questioned at length was Clara Whitcomb, the schoolteacher. She had gone very pale when the inspector called her name, though she answered steadily enough. Several people had seen her speaking to Halbridge on the lawn not long before his death. "What was the nature of that conversation?" asked Inspector Graves. Nothing of consequence." "That is for me to decide." Clara clasped her hands together. "Mr. Halbridge had agreed to review a proposal for repairs at the school. I asked whether he had done so." "And had he?" "He said he was occupied and that I should not press him in public." The inspector's tone remained neutral. "Were you on good terms with him?" She looked directly at him then. "No," she said. That honest answer caused a rustle among the villagers still waiting in the hall. "No," said Graves. "No. He had influence over the school committee and used it. He enjoyed reminding people of what they owed him. He had a manner of generosity that made one feel perpetually in debt." The inspector made a note. "After this conversation, where did you go?" "To the stall near the bandstand. Mrs. Dalton can tell you I was there. I bought raffle tickets from her." Mrs. Dalton, when consulted, confirmed this, though not with perfect certainty as to time. She was there, yes, or near there. One does lose track in the excitement of a fete. One did indeed. By early evening, the village had already begun to arrange the dead man's final minutes into competing versions, each one shaped by preference and prejudice. Some favored the school teacher as the obvious suspect, young, reserved, not village-born, and openly at odds with the victim. Others looked toward Lydia Fenwick, who stood to inherit a considerable sum if her uncle had made no recent changes to his will. A few mentioned Mr. Julian Pritchard, Halbridge's estate manager, who had the strained look of a man who kept difficult secrets for difficult employers. The inspector, to his credit, had committed himself to none of these too early. As the light faded over St. Aldwyn, he asked to see Hallbridge's study. It was a large, orderly room with dark shelves, a partner's desk, and a pair of French windows opening onto the side garden. The constable had already searched the dead man's pockets and found the expected watch, keys, handkerchief, and wallet. But no letter. "That is odd," said Inspector Graves. "Yes," said the elderly lady quietly from the doorway. He turned. He had noticed her earlier, of course. Village events always had one or two elderly observers who seemed ornamental and turned out, on closer acquaintance, to know everything. There was something in her expression that made him step toward her rather than dismiss her. "You have an idea, madam?" "Oh, no," she said mildly. "Not an idea, only a small observation. If a gentleman receives a letter that disturbs him very much, keeps it in his pocket, and is then killed before tea, it seems rather likely that the letter mattered to someone else too." Inspector Graves gave the faintest smile. "Yes, it does." She looked about the study with quiet interest. Everything was neat, but it was the neatness that suggested interference rather than habit. A blotter lay square to the desk. The inkstand was centered. The waste-paper basket, however, had been pushed back at an angle, as though someone had moved hastily and then tried imperfectly to restore order. The inspector followed her gaze and bent to examine it. Inside were only 3 items: an envelope addressed in a firm, masculine hand, a torn seed catalogue, and a single half-sheet of paper burned at one corner as though someone had tried to destroy it in the grate and then thought better of it. Graves lifted the half-sheet carefully. Most of the writing had gone, but not all. There remained only a few words, ragged yet legible enough to chill the room. "You promised. 30 years. Buried. Silence. No signature. No date. But enough." The inspector read it twice. Behind him, the house seemed to grow very still. Outside, the last of the villagers were being sent home in subdued clusters beneath a sky turning grey with evening. "A promise," he said. The elderly lady folded her hands. "Yes," she said softly. "And when people have kept silence for 30 years, Inspector, it is usually because the truth is something very dreadful indeed." Inspector Graves stood for several seconds with the half-burned paper held carefully between his fingers. The faint smell of scorched parchment still clung to it. Whoever had attempted to destroy the note had clearly changed their mind or been interrupted before the fire could finish its work. 30 years, he repeated thoughtfully. The elderly lady beside him gave a small nod, as though the number itself held a quiet significance. "Yes," she said. "That length of time often suggests something from the past that people believed safely forgotten. The difficulty with such things is that the past has a habit of resurfacing when one least expects it." Inspector Graves placed the fragment into an evidence envelope. "You speak as though you've seen it before." "Oh, as many times," she said gently. "Villagers remember everything, even when people pretend they do not." The inspector regarded her for a moment. He had been a policeman long enough to recognize when someone possessed more than idle curiosity. "You live in St. Aldwyn?" "Yes, just along Church Lane." "And you knew Mr. Hallbridge well?" Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "Well enough to observe him, which is often more useful than knowing someone intimately." Graves allowed himself the smallest smile. "That is very nearly a detective's answer." She did not respond to that, but her gaze drifted again across the study. Inspector Graves followed it. The room was impeccably ordered. Hallbridge, it seemed, had been a man who valued control over his accounts, his estate, and perhaps over other people as well. Yet there were small irregularities, and the disturbed wastebasket, of course, and something else. The inspector stepped toward the desk. A ledger lay open, the neat columns of figures ending abruptly halfway down the page. The pen beside it had dried with a faint smear of ink on the nib. "He was working here this morning," Graves said. "So it appears," Miss Marple replied. Yet according to his niece, he received that disturbing letter before lunch. Yes, and kept it in his pocket. Quite. But it's not there now. Miss Marple gave a quiet hum of agreement. Inspector Graves straightened. Which means someone removed it after he read it. Or before he died, she said softly. The inspector considered that. It suggested something deliberate. A meeting, perhaps, arranged after the letter was received. A confrontation in the rose garden, at a moment in which Hulbridge might have taken the letter from his pocket to show the person who had written it, or the person who feared it. "Did Mr. Hulbridge have many visitors this morning?" Graves asked the housekeeper when she was summoned. Mrs. Belling, a severe woman who had served the household for nearly 20 years, answered carefully. "Not many, Inspector. Only the usual deliveries. The gardener called about the fete arrangements, and Mr. Pritchard came briefly." "Mr. Julian Pritchard?" "Yes, sir, the estate manager." "And when was that?" "Just after 11. "What was the nature of the visit?" "I couldn't say. They spoke in the study with the door closed." Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "Did Mr. Pritchard seem upset when he left?" Mrs. Belling hesitated. "He seemed tense." "Tense how?" "Well, sir, Mr. Pritchard is generally a quiet sort of man. But when he came out of the study, he looked rather pale, and he left without staying for tea as he usually would." The inspector made a note. "Did anyone else visit Mr. Hulbridge before the fete began?" Mrs. Belling shook her head. "Not that I saw." When she had gone, Graves paced slowly across the room. "Estate managers often know a great deal about their employers," he said. "Accounts, land disputes, old arrangements." "Old promises," Miss Marple suggested. "Yes." The inspector paused by the French windows and looked out across the dimming garden. The rose beds where Hulbridge had died were visible through the hedges, pale shapes in the evening light. 30 years ago, he said thoughtfully. That would place us somewhere around the mid-1990s. Miss Marple's knitting needles had appeared in her hands again, though she had not yet begun to knit. "Indeed." Graves glanced back at her. "Something happened then?" "Yes." "And it involved Mr. Hulbridge?" "Almost certainly." The inspector leaned against the window frame. "I wonder," he said slowly, "who else in this village has been here that long?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Most of them, Inspector." The following morning, St. Aldwyn awoke beneath a low sky heavy with rain. The cheerful decorations from the fete still hung limply along the lane, though the bunting now seemed curiously inappropriate. By breakfast time, the village had divided itself neatly into theories. Some believed Clara Whitcomb had quarrelled with Hulbridge and struck him in anger. Others insisted Lydia Fenwick had finally grown tired of her uncle's control and seized an opportunity. A few whispered darker possibilities involving the estate finances and Julian Pritchard. Inspector Graves began his inquiries with the estate manager. Pritchard received him in the small office adjoining the estate stables. He was a narrow man in his early 40s with tired eyes and careful manners. The tension Mrs. Belling had mentioned still clung to him like a shadow. "You saw Mr. Hulbridge yesterday morning," the inspector began. "Yes." "What was the purpose of your visit?" "Estate matters." "Be more specific." Pritchard shifted slightly. "Some tenant disputes, and the quarry lease." The inspector watched him steadily. "Did he receive a letter that upset him?" A flicker passed across Pritchard's face before he could hide it. I believe so." "Did he show it to you?" "No." "But you know it existed?" "Yes." "How?" Pritchard hesitated. "Because he mentioned it," he said finally. "What exactly did he say?" The estate manager swallowed. "He said the past had come back to trouble him." Inspector Graves leaned forward slightly. "And did you ask what he meant?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Pritchard's voice dropped. "He said some promises should never be made, because eventually someone would come to collect." The inspector let the words settle. And then? Then he told me to forget I had asked. Inspector Graves was silent for a moment. Did you forget? No. The answer came quietly but firmly. Did you know what promise he meant? Pritchard did not reply immediately. Instead, he looked past the inspector through the open stable door toward the grey morning fields beyond. I suspected, he said at last. Suspected what? Pritchard turned back slowly. That it had something to do with what happened here 30 years ago. Inspector Graves' eyes narrowed. And what happened 30 years ago, Mr. Pritchard? For the first time, the estate manager seemed genuinely uneasy. A man died, he said. Inspector Graves waited. Pritchard continued reluctantly. It was ruled an accident, a fall from the old quarry cliff. Who was the man? Pritchard's voice grew quieter still. Thomas Whitcomb. The name hung in the room like a sudden gust of cold air. Inspector Graves straightened. Whitcomb? Yes. The same surname as the school teacher. Pritchard nodded slowly. Yes. Inspector Graves felt the pieces begin to shift into place. Outside, the rain began to fall harder against the stable roof. And somewhere in the quiet village of St. Aldwyn, the truth buried for 30 years had just begun to stir. The rain fell steadily throughout the morning, turning the gravel lanes of St. Aldwyn dark and slick. Water dripped from the hedges and gathered in small shining pools beneath the stone walls. The village, which had been so lively only the day before, now seemed subdued, as though the weather itself understood that something had been disturbed. Inspector Graves walked slowly along Church Lane with his coat collar turned up against the drizzle. The name Thomas Whitcomb lingered heavily in his mind. A man dead 30 years ago, a letter mentioning promises and silence. And now Edward Halbridge murdered. And it was difficult to believe those events were unrelated. He stopped outside the modest brick house where Clara Whitcomb lodged with Mrs. Dalton's cousin. Light showed faintly through the sitting-room curtains. When Clara opened the door, she looked as though she had slept very little. Her face was pale but composed. She stepped aside to allow the inspector in without protest. I suppose, she said quietly, this is about my father. Inspector Graves removed his hat. You already know, then. She gave a small, tired smile. In a village like this, Inspector, one does not remain ignorant for long. They sat in the small parlor where a coal fire burned low. Clara folded her hands in her lap, waiting. Graves spoke carefully. Your father died 30 years ago at the old quarry. It was recorded as an accident. Yes, but you do not believe it was an accident. She looked directly at him. There was no hesitation now. No, she said. Inspector Graves leaned slightly forward. Why not? Clara's eyes moved briefly toward the rain-streaked window before returning to him. Because my father was not a careless man. He worked at the quarry for nearly 10 years. He knew every path, every edge of that cliff. Yet they said he slipped. And you believed otherwise? Yes. Why? She hesitated. Because of what he told my mother before he died. The inspector waited. He had argued with someone. Clara continued slowly. A man of influence in the village. Someone who believed he could do whatever he wished without consequence. Did your father name him? Clara shook her head. No, but my mother believed she knew. Who? Edward Halbridge. The name fell between them like a quiet confirmation. Inspector Graves studied her face. Your mother never went to the police. She was afraid. Halbridge owned most of the land here. He employed half the village, and there was no proof. So she kept silent. Yes, for 30 years. Clara's voice softened. Until recently. Graves watched her closely. What changed? My mother died last winter, she said. The inspector nodded slightly. And you came to St. Aldwyn? Yes. To learn the truth? To see the man responsible, she said simply. Inspector Graves considered this carefully. "Did you confront Mr. Halbridge?" Clara did not answer at once. Finally, she said, "Not at first, but eventually." "Yes. When?" "Yesterday morning." The inspector's attention sharpened. "Was in his study?" "Yes." "And what did you say to him?" "I told him I knew what had happened to my father." "And his reaction?" Clara gave a faint, humorless smile. He laughed. The inspector said nothing. "He told me I had no proof," she continued. "He said that unfortunate accidents occurred all the time." "Did he threaten you?" "No." "What then?" "He offered money." Graves' eyebrows rose. "To leave the village, to forget everything." "And you refused?" "Of course." "Did he mention any promise?" Clara's expression shifted slightly. "Yes." "What did he say?" "He said the past had already been settled, that people had agreed to keep certain matters quiet." "Who were these people?" "I don't know. He would not say." Inspector Graves sat back slowly. "And after this conversation?" "I left." "Did you see him again before the fete?" "Yes." "On the lawn?" "The argument people witnessed?" "Yes." "What was said then?" "He warned me not to cause trouble." "And you?" "I told him the truth had a way of surfacing." The inspector studied her for a long moment. "You understand," he said carefully, "that many people will believe you had reason to kill him." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Yes." "But you didn't?" "No." "Where were you at the time of the murder?" "I was near the bandstand selling raffle tickets with Mrs. Dalton." Graves nodded slowly. That alibi had already been partially confirmed. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. "You believe Edward Halbridge killed your father?" he said. Yes." "And yet someone else killed Halbridge?" "Yes." Inspector Graves turned back toward her. "Which means," he said quietly, "someone else also knew the truth about 30 years ago." Clara did not reply, but something in her expression suggested she had already reached that same conclusion. Across the village, in her small sitting room on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat beside the window with her knitting. The rain had stopped completely now. She was not looking at her needles. Instead, she was thinking about promises. Promises were curious things, she reflected. People believed them binding, honorable even. Yet very often they were merely convenient ways to bury unpleasant truths. 30 years was a very long time to keep silence. But not everyone, she suspected, had done so willingly. Her needles paused again as a particular memory returned to her, something Mrs. Dalton had said during the fete, about the past, about the quarry, and about the men who had been present that day. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she murmured. "That is very like human nature indeed." The following afternoon brought a thin, pale sunlight that struggled through the retreating clouds. St. Aldwyn had resumed some semblance of its ordinary rhythm. Shop doors opened, bicycles rattled along the lane, and the church bell marked the hour with calm indifference. Yet beneath the surface, the village remained unsettled. Inspector Graves returned to Alderbrook House shortly after noon. The staff had tidied the rooms as best they could, but the air still carried the faint tension left behind by sudden violence. Graves had spent the morning reviewing the few records he could locate concerning the quarry accident 30 years earlier. The file itself was thin, remarkably thin for a death that had once stirred considerable local interest. Thomas Whitcomb had fallen from the quarry edge late one afternoon. 2 men had been nearby. One was Edward Halbridge. The other was Julian Pritchard's father, Arthur Pritchard, who had been the estate manager at the time. Graves turned this information over slowly in his mind as he walked through the study once more. The half-burned note lay sealed in its envelope on the desk. The fragment still troubled him. "You promised." 30 years. Buried. Silence. A promise implied more than one participant. Someone had agreed to keep the truth hidden. Well, the inspector was studying the room again when a soft knock sounded at the door. The elderly lady from Church Lane stepped inside with a polite nod. "I hope I'm not intruding, Inspector." "Not at all," Graves said, gesturing toward a chair. "I was beginning to suspect you might appear." Miss Marple smiled faintly and sat down. "I've been thinking about the quarry accident," she said. "As have I." "Yes, but I suspect I have been thinking about it rather differently." Graves leaned against the desk, interested. "You believe the death of Thomas Whitcomb was not an accident?" "I believe it was something much more inconvenient," she said gently. The inspector folded his arms. "Go on." "In villages," Miss Marple said, "certain events are remembered not because people wish to remember them, but because they cannot quite forget them. So when something unpleasant occurs, the story becomes softened over time. Details are rearranged, explanations grow. Convenient. You believe that happened here?" "Yes." "And the promise mentioned in the letter?" "I suspect it refers to an agreement made at the time." Inspector Graves considered this. "Between Halbridge and Arthur Pritchard?" "Quite possibly." He frowned slightly. "But why would they need such an agreement?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she resumed her work. "Because two men present at a fatal fall might each see something the other would prefer forgotten." Graves' attention sharpened. "You think they witnessed the incident together?" "Yes." "And agreed to conceal the truth? Or at least to say as little as possible?" The inspector walked slowly to the window, thinking. If Whitcomb didn't simply fall. Miss Marple finished the thought quietly. "Then someone pushed him." The words hung in the still room. Graves turned back toward her. "You believe Halbridge killed Whitcomb?" "I believe it is possible. And Arthur Pritchard helped conceal it. Or perhaps simply chose silence over scandal." The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully, which would explain the promise. "Yes, but that was 30 years ago." "Indeed. So why now?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "Because secrets rarely remain comfortable forever." The inspector studied her. "You think someone recently broke that silence?" "Yes. Clara Whitcomb confronted Halbridge." "That would certainly disturb an old arrangement." "But she didn't kill him." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, I do not believe she did." "Why not?" "Because revenge, when it has waited 30 years, tends to be very deliberate. Clara is a thoughtful young woman. If she had intended murder, she would not have argued with him publicly beforehand." Graves slowly nodded. "That leaves someone else?" "Yes. Someone who knew the truth all along." "Exactly." The inspector walked back toward the desk and glanced again at the fragment of burnt paper. "If Halbridge received this letter yesterday morning?" "Yes." "Then the person who wrote it must have been ready to break that promise." Miss Marple smiled quietly. "And people who break promises after 30 years usually do so because they have grown tired of carrying them." Inspector Graves was silent for several seconds. Then he said slowly, "No, Arthur Pritchard is dead." "Yes, but his son is very much alive." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Yes," she said softly. "Julian Pritchard." The inspector straightened. "And if his father told him the truth?" Miss Marple looked up. "Then he would know exactly what Edward Halbridge had done." Graves stared at the rain-damp garden outside the window. The pieces were shifting again, quietly but unmistakably. A promise made 30 years ago. A letter demanding its end, and a man who had lived his entire life knowing what his father had helped bury. Inspector Graves turned back toward Miss Marple. "Which means," he said slowly, "Julian Pritchard may have had a very strong reason to confront Edward Halbridge yesterday." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Yes. And perhaps," she added gently, "say a much stronger reason than anyone has yet considered." Inspector Graves did not move immediately after Miss Marple spoke. He stood for a long moment beside the study window, looking out over the garden where the roses had already begun to shed their petals in the damp air. "Strong reason," he repeated quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "though not necessarily the reason one first imagines." The inspector turned toward her. "You don't believe Julian Pritchard killed Hellbridge?" Miss Marple laid her knitting gently in her lap. "No. In fact, I believe he was probably the last person who wished Edward Hellbridge dead yesterday." Graves raised an eyebrow. "That's a surprising conclusion." "Not really," she said mildly. "You see, Inspector, people who carry heavy secrets often become quite cautious about disturbing them. Julian Pritchard lived his entire life knowing something terrible had happened long ago, but also knowing his father had helped bury it. That sort of inheritance tends to make a man careful rather than reckless." The inspector sat opposite her. "But if not Pritchard," he said, "then we are back where we began." "Oh no," Miss Marple replied gently. "Not at all." She folded her hands together. "Let us consider the letter." Inspector Graves nodded. "Someone wrote to Hellbridge demanding the truth about what happened 30 years ago." "Yes. And Hellbridge kept that letter in his pocket all morning, until someone removed it." "Exactly." Graves leaned forward slightly. "The murderer?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or someone who did not wish the inspector to read it too soon." He watched her closely. "You know who wrote it?" "Yes. Clara Whitcomb." Miss Marple shook her head softly. "No." The inspector frowned. "But she confronted Hellbridge about her father." "Indeed she did, quite openly and rather emotionally, which is precisely why she did not write that letter." Graves was silent. Miss Marple continued in her calm, thoughtful voice. "Clara came to the village seeking answers, but she did not yet know the whole truth. The person who wrote that letter did." "And who was that?" Miss Marple looked toward the study door. "The person who had the most to lose if the past were examined too closely." At that moment, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Inspector Graves had asked Lydia Fenwick to return to the house that afternoon for further questions. She entered the room now, composed but clearly strained. "You wish to see me, Inspector?" "Yes," he said quietly. Lydia glanced briefly toward Miss Marple before taking a seat. Graves spoke carefully. "Miss Fenwick, I have been reviewing the events surrounding your uncle's death. Something has become rather clear." "And what is that?" "That your uncle was not the only person who feared the truth about Thomas Whitcomb." A flicker crossed Lydia's expression. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple spoke softly. "Oh, I think you do." Lydia turned toward her sharply. "You received a letter yesterday morning as well," Miss Marple continued. "Not directly, of course, but you saw the one sent to your uncle." Lydia said nothing. "You went into his study after he read it," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps while he was on the telephone. You saw what it contained." Inspector Graves watched Lydia carefully. "The note mentioned 30 years of silence," he said. Lydia's composure wavered. Miss Marple continued, her voice as mild as ever. "You see, Inspector, there was something very curious about the old quarry accident. Edward Hellbridge and Arthur Pritchard were both present, but there was a third witness." Graves frowned slightly. "There was?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. She turned toward Lydia. "A frightened young girl standing just beyond the quarry path." Lydia's face had gone pale. "You," Miss Marple said quietly. The room was utterly silent. Inspector Graves looked between them. "You saw what happened." Lydia's voice came out thin. "I was only a child." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly, "but children see far more than adults realize." Tears had begun to gather in Lydia's eyes. "My uncle pushed him," she whispered. Graves leaned forward sharply. "You're certain?" "Yes." Her voice shook now. "Thomas Whitcomb argued with him. I don't know about what. They were shouting, and then my uncle shoved him. He slipped over the edge." The words came faster now, years of silence breaking loose. My father, Arthur Pritchard, told Halbridge they had to say it was an accident. He said no one would believe the truth anyway, and Halbridge promised to protect our family if we kept quiet. Miss Marple nodded gently. A promise buried in silence. Lydia covered her face briefly. I never meant to kill him. Inspector Graves spoke quietly. Tell us what happened yesterday. Lydia took a trembling breath. I saw the letter Clara had sent. I realized she would expose everything. The scandal would destroy us. My father is gone, but his name would be ruined. So you confronted your uncle? Yes. In the rose garden. He laughed at me, just like he laughed at Clara. He said no one would believe a story from 30 years ago. Her hands trembled. I pushed him. I only meant to frighten him. But he stumbled backward onto the gravel. He struck the stone border. Inspector Graves thought of the wound the doctor had described. He died instantly. Lydia nodded slowly. I took the letter from his pocket and tried to burn it. But someone was coming, so I left. Silence filled the study. After a moment, Inspector Graves stood. Miss Fenwick, he said gently, I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me. She nodded faintly, as though she had known this moment would come for many years. As the constable led her away, the quiet of Alderbrook House returned. Sir Inspector Graves remained in the study for several minutes afterward. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. At last, he said, You understood it all rather early, didn't you? Miss Marple smiled softly. Not everything, but once one remembers that children often witness the truths adults try to hide, the rest becomes rather clearer. Graves nodded. And the village? Oh, the village will recover, she said. Villages always do, though they will speak about this for a very long time. She looked out toward the rose garden. The curious thing about promises, she added thoughtfully, is that they are rarely buried as deeply as people imagine. Outside, the wind stirred the fallen petals along the garden path. And at last, after 30 years of silence, the truth had finally been spoken.